three, and we are live. Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of Global Citizens. My name is Calvin, and I am the show's host, and I'm also its creator. So, this particular episode for Global Citizens is actually really special in its own right, as it is a redemption story for myself. So, just to let you guys know, I started this webcast in September in 2019. So while it has now reached up to 60th episode thus far. However, I did not have the easy start going doing it, and in fact, my very first episode was an utter failure because at that time Facebook decided to implement some new feature that actually get rid of an existing feature in order for you to invite a guest to go live. So now the fact that I actually managed to redeem myself in an extent with a number that is considered my birth country's country code is special in its own way. So my guest for today has a lot of resume to the point that I think if I mention it, I will lose my broadcast time. Okay. So he is the phantom of global citizens because of that aforementioned accident. So along with that, this gentleman has an in-depth experience in financial and payment technology. He has driven success in a number of business development initiatives and complex customer engagement across the Southeast Asia. Some of his accomplishments include managing new business expansion for Mastercard, if you guys have seen the title card in Indonesia, along with securing Mastercard's participation as part of the national payment gateway in Indonesia. He's also managed FleetCor Asia business expansion and is now an angel investor for several startups and head of regional business development and payment partnership in Gojek in Singapore. So without further ado, please let me invite the phantom of global citizens. Please welcome Mr. Saurav Ray. How are you, my friend?
Hi, man. How's it going?
Yeah,
I'm good. Yeah, it's good to finally get to do this after trying and failing the first time.
yeah. Well, we learn, right?
Yeah,
We screw up, we learn.
I think you found better software to do this now. This
Thank
is
you.
very impressive.
Thank you, thank you. Yeah, it took 3 tries to finally get it done, and it took 60 plus episodes to finally redeem myself. So, hooray! You learn along the way, right?
Yeah, no, and it's great that you've managed to kind of interview so many different people, right? And like with each interview, you kind of get a little bit more, a little bit more structured and a little bit more kind of learn a little bit in terms of the technology that you're using and what's the best way to do it. So, I'm benefiting from that definitely.
Yeah, I think aside from technology, of course, the main intention of the show. So, yeah, for those of you who just tuned in for the very first time, Global Citizens is a live webcast whereby I invited individuals who has experienced a multicultural lifestyle. So, for example, like myself, I'm a third culture kid. I grew up in Singapore, but I'm actually an Indonesian citizenship by birth. And along with that, I also invited expatriates, nomads, and basically individuals who have experienced the life outside of their passport country. So why this profile is because I want people to actually see the difference between living in a country and when you visited a country for a vacation or a holidays. Because the main difference is that while you are exposed to a new set of culture when you are traveling, you are going to come back to your home country a few days after or even weeks the most. Whereas if you live in the country, you have to adjust to the mindset, you have to carry on, you have to understand the perspective of the locals. And as a result, it may influence your thinking decision or your philosophy moving forward. So one example is that if I say I'm Indonesian and people tell me you have visited Bali, I'm sorry, that is not a sensible answer because it's a completely different experience. So yeah, without further ado, I will pass the floor back to Saurabh. Maybe Saurabh, if you don't mind introducing a little bit more about yourself, my friend.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So I grew up in India. I went to high school there, moved to Singapore to do my university, Singapore Management University. Um, yeah, graduated, started working in Singapore. But since then, I've done a couple of roles overseas. So I did a short-term assignment in Moscow, in Russia, in the middle of the winter, no less.
Wow.
And I spent 2 years in your lovely country in Indonesia. So kind of helping Mastercard to set up our local payments infrastructure there. And it was a really life-changing experience for me because like I think with Singapore and particularly working here, you get kind of used to like doing things at a certain pace. Like, you kind of walk into every meeting expecting that, you will basically reach some objective at the end, right? And in Indonesia, you need time to build up to the objective, right? So it takes like 3 to 4 meetings to get to even deciding what the objectives are, right? In some ways. And I think it's different, but it's also important because you learn to build up the relationship in a certain way. And obviously the relationships that I have in Indonesia now are very strong because you take time to actually build up to it. Right? So yeah, that's just kind of like my 30 seconds.
Yep. All right. So the very first question is actually a standard question that I ask people who has grown up out overseas. So, how would you define your home though? Is it relate more to the place, the people around you, or even a certain feeling of synergy that you may experience when even like the first few weeks or even days that you are there?
I think it definitely for me relates more to the people. Like growing up in India, for example, like my dad actually used to work in the merchant navy, like so he was sailing for most of the year, right? And so when we moved to Singapore, it was like the first time where we actually were able to like live together, like permanently, right? So my dad wasn't sailing anymore; he was going to office and coming back home, right? Which was a very new experience for me. And I think it's definitely for me knowing that I have like a support system in place. So even while I was in Jakarta, for example, I really enjoyed it. I felt like my support system was still back here in Singapore, right? So I think that kind of really makes it so even if I were to move back to India right now, I'd still feel a little bit out of place simply because my support system is here, right? My wife, my family, everything is here, right? So
Yeah, I get the feeling of that. I have difficulty when I actually move back to Indonesia because I'm so used to growing up in Singapore, and in fact, most of my conversation has always been with my friends who are in Singapore, and in fact, I don't really know any friends here in Indonesia, and of course, with the way the world is with COVID, it's not exactly making it easier for you to interact outside of your own circle. So you have to make your own social circles within the world of the internet. Yep. So I think I get where you're coming from on that. And yeah, along with that though, you mentioned that it was a brand new experience, right? With your dad who used to work as a merchant navy, and then now he's back. And when he returned back to the office,
yeah.
do you feel your international background has greatly benefited you in terms of your life, maybe, or your career? And however, do you also feel that there are some emotional baggage that confuse you with your own national identity?
um so I feel like having had the privilege of living in different places and working in different places, I think it's definitely benefited me greatly from the point of view that you start to understand that not everybody thinks like you or has the same values as you, right? Or
Yeah.
even values the same things that you do. And so I feel like in certain ways it definitely helps to build one's empathy. And I felt that particularly in Indonesia because, like I told you before, like when you live and work in Singapore for a while, you get used to a certain pace of things happening and things getting done. And in Indonesia, it was like quite different in the sense that initially I'd find myself quite frustrated in terms of how do you, why does it take so long for for people to say yes or no to even like meeting with you, right? And what I realized is that a lot of times, like in Indonesia, because they're so concerned about making sure that you feel welcomed and things like that, they don't want to just meet with you for a coffee or something without knowing for a fact that they will have something to talk to you about or something to like, to work with you on, right?
Yep.
Whereas in Singapore, it's like it's quite normal for you and me to like connect over a beer and share experiences, even if nothing really comes out of it from a business perspective, right?
Yep.
So I think you kind of get to learn and appreciate the differences in cultures and in people's values. So I think it's been hugely beneficial. And for me, it's also made me comfortable with the idea of you know going somewhere else to work, for example, right? I don't feel like I need to be in one particular place. I mean, there are obviously reasons why I enjoy living in Singapore. I love the country, I love the people, I love the food, everything, right? There's definitely synergy, as you mentioned.
Yep.
But at the same time, like if tomorrow Gojek told me, hey, can you help us with a project in the Philippines or something, like I'd be comfortable taking on that as well.
Okay, I'm glad you mentioned on that though. Okay, so along with Singapore, which is technically considered your second home, Moscow, and then after that, Jakarta, yeah?
Mhm.
What has been the challenge though of working in a developed country as compared to a developing country like Indonesia? Because like what you said, it was something that also amused me in a sense or confused me. It's because I recall that there was one time that we actually need to go for a meeting and it was a 5 hours meeting. The first 3.5 hours is not even an actual meeting, it's a bonding session. And the remaining 1.5 hours, it's the meeting is something that you can actually do with just an actual newsletter blast. So yeah, can you elaborate a little bit more on that, Saurabh?
Um, so I think it's just different, right? I mean, I've tried my best, and I continue to try my best not to judge things as better or worse. I just kind of classify them as different, right?
Yeah.
And I don't think there is a best way to do things, right? I mean, I think different things work in different cultural settings and in different contexts. So in Indonesia, 5 hour meetings work because that's just how people do things, right? And if I wanted to try and squeeze in, like, getting to an outcome within 30 minutes, it wouldn't work because in order for things to work, you need to have people buy in, you need to have people support, and you need to have
Yep.
people to help you, right?
Correct.
And people can only help you if they trust you and they like you. And so in Indonesia, building that trust and getting people to like you is important. And I think that's fine because at the end of the day, like when I was in Jakarta, I never had to worry about anything because like there were like 20 people who would like check in on me. Hey, do you have food? Do you have you know do you have everything you need? Do I need to send you food? Like when I was sick, like people would like call me like every few minutes, like hey, are you okay? Should I deliver some medicine? Should I deliver some food? Like that's that's something that I'd never encountered in Singapore, to be honest, because in Singapore, like people just expect to get things done, right? And so relationship building comes as a part of doing the work as opposed to coming before doing the work, right?
Correct.
Like some of the best friends that I have in Singapore are people that I work with in terms of like projects and like is whether it was university or even afterwards, right? Even at work. And I think like our friendship was built more on the fact that we had to figure stuff out together and work together on something.
Yeah.
And that's how you build trust in Singapore, right? You actually prove by doing. Whereas
Yeah,
in
trial by
Indonesia,
fire, trial by fire. Whereas in Indonesia, they just
you tend to like build trust by building trust. Let's put it that way, right? Like spending time with people, having tea and coffee with them, like all that stuff, right? Which I enjoyed. I mean, like I think if you're naturally extroverted, which I am, you can kind of enjoy both types of experiences.
Yep.
And in Indonesia, of course, like you have the added benefit that like people are just like totally okay to like spend time with you after work. And given that at that time, like I wasn't married and I didn't have like my family in Indonesia, it was great because like, even after working hours, like people would like, call me over to their houses or like, take me out for dinner or like, take me for golf on the weekends and stuff like that. Right. So it was great.
Just to let you guys know, Saurav just celebrated his wedding anniversary. So congratulations to the friend. Yeah.
The first one. Don't congratulate me too much yet.
Well, but right now, for if any of his friends who are watching, he's already married, so can't really go out as much as last time if he's visiting.
Yeah. Well, there's also COVID, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that has been tough for me personally since all the stuff that you mentioned, I can't really do them. So that's kind of stinks, I guess. But yeah, this is the way the world has happened. So we kind of need to adjust to it. I mean, there's positive and negative also. And for one thing is that, well, for me is I get to meet a lot of different individuals to actually ask a lot of personnel with unique profiles on their own. So this is really interesting, and to me it has already been very beneficial. Okay, so can I ask you something, man? Like back in Indonesia or even in Moscow itself, do you have any favorite learning opportunity? People like to call this a failure, I guess, but in my show, I don't like to call it because I always feel that one of the main benefit, especially, is that if you're an expat, is that well, people understand that you might not immediately attune to their mindset. So there are times whereby it's a little bit of trial and error. Do you have any of this, my friend?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think particularly in Indonesia, and for the reasons we alluded to earlier, I had a certain style that was kind of cultivated to, doing business in Singapore, which is directness.
Yep.
Right? Where you walk into a meeting, you flash up slides, and you start like talking through the slides immediately, right? And initially I was doing that quite a lot, and there was two things that I forgot to account for, right? One is the fact that in Indonesia, politeness always comes first, right? And by politeness, I mean like you spend time actually talking to people individually, asking them how they are, really making the effort to make that small talk, right? Whereas if you did that in Singapore, people would be like, why are you wasting time? We have 30 minutes for this meeting, like just finish the slides and get it over with. Yeah. So it was definitely different. And I think probably it culminated in having, particularly with like the regulatory bodies in Indonesia, you really have to respect the style with which they do things, right? Like one is they have like 20 people in the room. You should be greeting every single one of those people. You should like, ask about them and like, how they're doing, how their family is. That's just the culture, right? It's very challenging. And in Singapore, you would not think that way. If there's 20 people in a room, you would just like, okay,
hello, hi, okay,
hi,
let's go,
everyone, and let's just start, right? And so I think like particularly those meetings with Bank Indonesia and like Gojek, like I had to really change my style drastically. I think the other thing is like in Singapore, it's very normal to vocalize frustration in the sense that not in an abusive way, but in a way that you can tell people that you're frustrated about something, right? Like I wouldn't have a problem telling my colleague that I found that meeting really frustrating because like we couldn't get to this and that, right?
Yeah.
Whereas in Indonesia, I think like you have to deal with frustration differently. Like you deal with it softly, and you deal with it more kind of one-to-one, like interacting with people and explaining it to them in a very, very polite way, right? That's how you deal with regulators. That's how you deal with banks. That's how you deal with like any authority figure in Indonesia, right? And so that's the other lesson that I learned as well.
All right. Okay. So right now we actually would like to jump a little bit more, of course, on your niche. Yeah.
Mhm.
So you are an expert in financial technology. So you've implemented like, for example, your current role with Gojek is to introduce the business expansion on ASEAN region.
Mhm.
And the thing is that this is something that a friend of mine who he wanted to tune in for this, but he was unable to. So, okay, he mentioned before that Indonesia is considered evolve up to standard. Is that when even when you visited a market and then a regular shopkeeper can take out the GoPay machine and then says you can pay.
Hello. Hey, hi. Can't seem to hear
Okay.
you.
Oh, I think my
Hey, that's better. I still can't hear you though.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, can you hear me now? Sorry, there
No
was a
worries.
little.
You were talking about like the small shops having GoPay machines, etc. Yeah, go ahead.
Correct, correct. Yeah. So with regards to this, yeah, what development do you see though in financial technology in not only, let's say we just focus on Asia itself, because for one thing is that we are considered behind, I guess, in it. So yeah, what development do you see for this?
Um, I think one of the biggest challenges in Asia and a lot of the developing world is the fact that people have very unequal access to financial services.
Yep,
And that impacts your ability to access any kind of, whether it's social capital or even like capital that enables you to create something, right? Let's put it that way.
correct,
And that's a massive challenge because you essentially have like millions of people or hundreds of millions of people who don't have the opportunity to realize their potential, right? Whether it's from setting up a business, whether it's like, doing something creative, without access to funding, capital, loans, insurance, there's very little that you can actually do, right? And so you're kind of stuck in this cycle. One of the challenges that I think Gojek realized very early on is the fact that majority of the segments in Indonesia don't have access to traditional banking services
yep,
and the ability to like pay electronically or access loans. And so that's where Gojek decided that its mission was really not just like ride sharing or like delivering food, but actually enriching the lives of these SMEs and these drivers and making sure that they actually have a um, they have meaningful access to the kind of things that people like you and me take for granted, right?
yep,
And so following on from that, a lot of the stuff that we've done, particularly on the small merchant side, giving them access to electronic payments, but at the same time allowing them to access like, different funding methods, allowing them to order, for example, like supplies without having to actually leave the store. Um, the ability to potentially upgrade to like a bank account when they have enough savings built up. All of these things are very valuable, and they actually are determining factors in pushing an economy from developing to developed, right? If you contrast between, let's say, Singapore, which is highly developed, to, let's say, I'm taking Vietnam as an example, right? The biggest difference that you see is that in Singapore, like 98% to 99% of people actually are banked, right? They have bank accounts, they have an identity. Whereas in Vietnam, that bank number, particularly among the adult population, is probably in the 30% range, right? And that's a massive problem for Vietnam to actually move people from one social class to, let's say, the middle class, right? Because a majority of the people don't have access to the services that they need to be able to build up social capital and entrepreneurial capital to make that jump into the middle class, right? And so that's what, hopefully, I think technology is just a part of it. I think the other part is really just, having industry and government and others work together to deliver services that make sense, right? Because I think from a technology perspective, Indonesia is one of the most connected markets in the world, right? Like number one in terms of social media usage, internet penetration is high, smartphone penetration is high, and yet financial service penetration hasn't been able to kind of keep up, right?
Yeah.
I think the reason for that is not technology. The reason for that is just, risk models that aren't in line with, what the country needs. The fact that people don't make money the same way anymore, right? I mean, you think back to 20 years ago, what were your jobs, right? You go to an office, you have a salary, you have a bank account paying, you have money coming into your bank account every month, right? And that's how a bank would assess you for loans, for credit, for everything else. You fast forward to now and you have people who work as independent web designers, creatives, they work on a commission basis. They live, nomadically, they travel from place to place, and their income is lumpy, right? And you, of course, you also have the massive base of SMEs and small and medium merchants who are still kind of coming up the pyramid in terms of income, right? And those are the kind of new segments that banks need to kind of be able to build the right risk models for, right? Which they're working on, I think, at this point. So I think technology will solve the delivery problem, but you still have to also solve the risk problem and the modeling problem.
Okay. With regards to the modeling problem, yeah. So this is actually an incident I encountered around a few days back. So my mother actually was trying to purchase something from Lazada. So the thing is this: they are unable to supply with the equipment, so therefore they would refund you the money, right? However, the thing is this: for one thing, those within a senior citizen's age, they do not really understand about technology. They are, and well, for one thing is that they are not going to waste their time or spend their time to actually explore it. And therefore, for one thing is that you being their kids, you would need to be there. You need to help them with it, because you kind of worry is they might result in them subscribing to unnecessary, or they might be unaware of what is going on with it. One of the thing that is, of course, an issue is that, well, the vendors themselves, they, a lot of times, the ones on the other end may not even understand the technology well. They only understand their part is, I need to, let's say there's a subscription of this particular method, they will provide it, then that's it. And if there's any kind of screw up, they're not gonna know how to handle it.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to be the one that has the initiative on that. So how would you tackle on with regards to the generational differences?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And it's interesting because nobody is building for generational differences. I think very few people are building for generational differences, right? If you look at Asia in particular, the population is actually getting younger, not older, right?
Yeah.
And so if you and so what a lot of companies are essentially doing is they're kind of banking on this demographic dividend that they expect to cash in at some point when this young population becomes the spenders of tomorrow, right? And so a lot of the experiences, I completely agree with you. If I were to show my grandparents, hey, here, download Revolut and set up a digital bank, right? It's not really built for them. You're right. And so I think, obviously, to resolve that, you essentially need, specific training and specific tools. I think the other thing is also just in general, people actually wanting to upskill and to learn, because technology is not going to go backwards, right? It's only going to go forward.
Of course.
And so, even people like you and me, we're considered pretty old already, right? I mean, we're if you look at like some of the new platforms that are being built, they're not being built
Yeah.
with you and me in mind, right?
The youngest guest on my show is 21 years old. She has won several awards as a short film filmmaker, and she has recently become a published author. 21 years old.
Yeah,
That
yeah,
is
exactly. So
unprecedented.
that's my point, right? So I mean, I feel like, it's the onus is on everyone to try and keep themselves up to date from a learning perspective. But that being said, I think it's also contingent on tech companies and financial services companies to just make the process as simple as possible.
Yeah.
Right? Nobody likes inconvenience.
Correct. Yeah, that's really true. That's really true. Yeah. How would you implement it though? For one thing is that I think you mentioned it briefly earlier. It's like, for example, uh, there's a certain countries, of course, have a different way of how they should operate in the business, how they actually wanted to work. For one thing is like, let's say for one of the example you mentioned, yeah, is like they respect seniority above capability, and Indonesia is definitely one of them. So even though you could be actually somebody who is the most more capable than even somebody who could be in the industry but might not have been exposed to the new kind of knowledge. And then how would you actually tackle this? How would you convince them that what you are actually you're applying is actually much more efficient than just following along with the tradition?
Mm. I think like a lot of that comes from self-awareness, but
Yep.
a lot of it also comes from just macro trends that you can't control, right? Like if you think about like maybe like Kodak, like all those years ago, right? Kodak was being
Okay,
run by
Kodak.
very, very smart people, right? And a lot of them were young as well, who just didn't see digital coming, right? Same thing with
Yes.
like traditional print media, right? I saw this really nice comic strip. It's a Singapore-based comic strip. It's called The Woke Salaryman. They have it on Facebook. They have like a web comic on Facebook, and the guy talks about like all the different trends in the industry, why it's so important to like keep your skills up to date. And he gave the example of print media, where like for the last like 15 years, people have been talking about the death of print media.
Yeah.
Um, but like the print media companies were like, hey, but our revenues have been going up like every single year, right? And like it continued to be that way,
Yep.
like 2008, 2009, 2010, until suddenly their business was obsolete, just like they never saw it coming, right? It was
Correct.
everything is okay until everything was okay until it wasn't, right? And I think
Correct.
that's kind of like how think people are going to be forced to change, because there's always some kid in a basement somewhere who's frustrated and is going to build something that he
Yeah.
feels is going to do better than your product, right? I
Yeah.
think
Netflix was created because they were sick of Blockbuster's high rental fee.
yeah, exactly. And I think Revolut was created because the guy was just sick of how difficult it is to open a bank account. But because of Revolut, a lot of traditional banks have actually completely changed their process now. They understand that our traditional way of thinking and our traditional way of doing things is under threat, right?
Right.
If you look at like Singapore, just as a small market, Comfort Delgro and other taxi companies were like doing really, really well, and just had no incentive to change anything. Like their apps were terrible. Like their experience was bad. Like the you couldn't get a cab a lot of the time if it was raining, etc. And then Uber and Grab entered the market, and they were forced to change. Like they had no choice, right? So I think, in a sense, people will either be forced to have to change, or they'll be self-aware enough to change themselves, right?
Yep.
I think the challenge in a lot of like developing countries is that um, it's even more imperative because you don't want to leave people behind, right? Like Indonesia, countries like Indonesia, Vietnam, they have a very, very big percentage of the population that's I guess engaged in traditional labor and traditional ways of working, right? And
Correct.
so it's super important that the government invests money and time and effort into actually making sure that when the wave of change happens, these people are not left behind, right? Because
Correct.
that would be terrible.
Correct. Correct. Speaking of change, for one thing is that, of course, with the way with the pandemic now, like what you mentioned, people need to learn to adapt on changes. So one of the most prominent trend nowadays is the webinar. There's a lot of people or trainers who actually who has been doing it, but now they are benefiting out of it. It's because now their programs is just done by Zoom or even like maybe it's the StreamYard, the software that I'm using now. So along with that, though, this actually makes the world smaller in a sense. It's because now you are able to actually interact with people of different countries, different ethnicity, and everybody have a different kind of culture to it. So for how would you actually feel though that an intercultural knowledge could be beneficial to create an intercultural working environment, and yeah, or maybe an intercultural customer base?
I think it's definitely easier now to interact, but I think the challenge is still collaboration. I think it's one of the things that we took for granted a lot was like things like whiteboarding and stuff where you could get into a room with people and just kind of brainstorm and trash out ideas, use
Right.
post-it notes, like do that whole kind of design, customer centric design and things like that. um, and obviously you have to find new ways of doing that, right? So I think collaboration will probably be one of the first things that changes. I
Yeah.
think it's easier to collaborate face to face. Let's be honest, right? I mean, like
Yeah. Yeah.
nobody's gonna debate that. And it's easier to collaborate face to face, particularly if you and the person you're collaborating with are from different cultural backgrounds and so on and so forth, because it's kind of in a way easier to convey your point of view versus them conveying their point of view, as opposed to doing it virtually, right? It's not,
Yes.
things don't come across the same way, body language, etc. So I think that's something that we need to kind of like work towards, right? Like, how do we make cross-cultural exchanges easier and cross-cultural collaboration easier? um, I guess the other thing would be, time zones as well. I think like with business travel, it was just kind of, you just take for granted that like, okay, I'm going to be in the US, meeting with this person face to face. You don't need to worry about time zone. You spend like, 5 days, meet like a bunch of different people, and you get a lot done, right? Whereas now it's kind of like, okay, we have this 1 hour window every week where you can talk, right? And if you're collaborating with multiple parties, then it's like 1 hour per party per week, right? So
Right.
it is challenging. I think companies are also challenged in trying to get their workforces to collaborate, particularly if they're dispersed workforces. Now that you can't travel, right, even for internal company business. And I think what I'm reading a lot of is like people feel burnt out because you just kind of have to make that effort of staying up late or waking up early, and there's no other way around it, right? Before, you could pack all your stuff into like one trip. Okay, you're going to be jet lagged before and after, but that's fine, right? It's time box.
Right.
Whereas now this is like life, right, for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, the new normal. Yeah, I get where you're coming from. I think there's also certain things that need to change, like for example, how we approach. I think you mentioned it, but maybe we can elaborate some things like for example, there are certain customs whereby it is compulsory for you to meet up face to face, which nowadays of course you don't have the privilege of doing that because you can't even travel around anymore. So yeah, I think this would actually be much more a smoother transition, I guess, if there is like an introduction on how you actually have to act on the internet and etc. Yeah.
Mhm.
Okay. Okay. Saurav, I actually have two final questions for you.
Yeah, sure, absolutely.
Okay. So first off is this. Okay. Uh, what kind of support do you think is much more beneficial for an expatriate when he or she just come to a new country? Actually, because I know you mentioned you have read a lot from Indonesia, but at that time it was truly trial by fire kind of thing. It's because you need to focus on your work, but at the same time you just realize, oh no, there's cultural differences that I need to adjust to. What kind of support do you think though would be much easier in your transition at that time?
Uh, I think, I mean, I was lucky because like the company that I worked for had a very sizable workforce in Indonesia, but they were also people that I knew beforehand because in my Southeast Asia role I had worked with them as well, right? So it was not like walking into an office full of strangers like it
Yep.
was in Moscow. In Jakarta it was very different, right? Like a lot of these people were already my friends, and so it was not as hard of an adjustment. I think what would have definitely helped would have been, some just regular classes around, like, how do you deal with the regulator? How do you deal with, people in the government, things like that. Just cultural tips in terms of, body language, how you read the room, how you greet people, even how you dress. I started wearing batik because people felt
Every
like,
Friday, every Friday you must wear.
no, it wasn't just every Friday, because like I would go into the meetings and I was the only one in like a suit and tie. And people start, or at least my colleagues would tell me, like, if you do that, you're gonna make the other people feel uncomfortable because, they automatically feel more stressed out because you're in a suit, you're in a tie, and so try and like dress down. I wouldn't say dressing down, but like, try and try and follow the local norms, right? And so like
Yes.
I have like a wardrobe full of batiks as well. I
Yeah.
love I miss wearing them actually.
Yeah,
Uh,
I wear them on the show every time.
yeah, I really miss wearing my batiks. You can't really wear them here.
Oh, is
Um,
it? Okay.
well, you can, but like I mean, the context is different, right? I think it's
Yeah.
very meaningful, and I don't like to wear those things casually. Like
Yeah.
I mean, like batiks are used for formal meetings and for for celebrations and things like that. So just me wearing it to go get a coffee with a friend doesn't seem it doesn't seem appropriate.
Okay, let me give you an applause for that. I truly appreciate what you said. The reason being was that when I was a lot younger at that time, when because I was trying out a lot of different stuff, MLM is one of them. There's
Yeah.
one MLM that actually keep trying to promote batik products, but they try to market it by in order to stand out in clubbings and of course in order for them to be able to get more attention, which kind of offend me because this is in a sense is secret to an Indonesian. So it was personal to me at that time, and it actually is one of the reason why I actually decided to leave because I feel that there was lack of appreciation for the particular culture. So I truly appreciate on what you said on that.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, if you think about like just the cultural weight of what batik means to Indonesia, right? I
Yes.
mean, traditionally it was handmade, hand printed. It takes a lot of effort to make, right? Even one piece, right? And every piece is unique. And so, which is why I felt like, you can't like not treat it with the respect that it deserves, right? It's kind of like me wearing like a proper, like, Indian traditional wear and
Right.
going to get a coffee. Like it just doesn't make sense, right? I mean, these are
Right.
saved for special occasions and for the right kind of context.
Yep. Okay. This will be my last question, Sarah.
Mhm.
So, what is your advice, or do you have any books you want to recommend for those who may have experienced your lifestyle? Maybe they grow up from one country to another, And of course, in the future, they may want to consider a career in the tech industry, like what you are doing now.
So I think the books that I would recommend, actually, it doesn't really matter like what kind of career you want, or what kind of, whether you want to work overseas or not. I think the books that I would recommend are really, if you want to kind of build self-awareness, and just in general have a better picture of how to be more effective in any environment. I mean, there's three books I really recommend. The first is pretty predictable. It's called The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People.
I just finished reading it twice.
Right?
I just finished reading it.
Sorry?
I just finished reading it.
Yeah, exactly. So like, that's like it's almost like one of the books that I keep going back to over and over, right? The second one, which is not as common, is a book called Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. And why I think this book is really, really important for everyone to read. It was massive in me actually growing my self-awareness, because it's all about biases, right? And like how unconsciously our brain kind of tricks us into certain types of behaviors and certain types of responses, right? And certain ways of thinking, which you need to consciously break out of, right?
Correct.
So that's definitely a book I would recommend. And then the third book I would probably recommend is a book called Hit Refresh by Satya Nadella. So he's the CEO of Microsoft. So it's that one to me is kind of more of like a personal story of his, where he talks about his management style. He talks about, how he rose in the company, and he talks about how he expects leaders to behave. So I think those are kind of the three. So not really, sorry, I know your question was related to like
no,
people who want to live overseas or work overseas, but I feel like these are three books that will benefit anyone, regardless of your aspirations.
Sure. Yep. Okay. That is actually my last question. Yeah. So before we sign off, I need to send my appreciation to these two individuals, Mr. Fuji, who not only give a like, but he also shared this video. So thank you so much, my friend. And there's also Mr. Ben Katik. And there's one. Oh, this is yours. Okay. Yeah, so for those of you who will be watching this later on, there is a referral code for Airbnb and also StreamYard, which is the platform that I'm using. So I know you guys can't travel yet, but the thing is that it's good to have and just to give some sense of motivation. And if you are interested to try out something new, like for podcasts, like what I'm doing now, there's a $10 credit for StreamYard. Do check it out. So along with that, that is actually everything that I have. Saurav, do you have anything you want to mention?
No, thanks for having me. I mean, I think this is finally being able to get. Yeah, really appreciate it.
Yeah, I was really excited about it. It's like, wow, I've come quite a bit since. Yeah, I attempted this around the same time, right? I think last time when I asked you to do it. So
yeah, it was September or something.
Yeah, so this is a little redemption story for my own, and yeah, really appreciate you for coming to the show. Thank you so much, Saurav. And other than that, to everyone, please take care of yourself, stay safe, wash your hand, put on your mask, or do whatever it takes to make sure that you guys are healthy. It's because now we don't know yet how the situation is going to develop, but the thing is that it doesn't hurt to stay safe. So other than that, thank you so much, Saurav. Yeah, that's everything that I have. So with that, we end episode 62 of Global Citizens, conversation with a global financial technology expert. So do take care, guys, and see you.
Thanks.